Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, January 18. We're back. Hopefully, I always like to talk about the weather, but hopefully that was the last storm last night in the rain. We got sun coming and spring already, huh? We'll keep our fingers crossed they keep the snow. So back to reality. First of all, we like to start with the epidemiology because we're seeing some really encouraging signs kind of across the board, aren't we?
Yeah, I think things are better across the board, and it's good to give that information to our clinical providers. We're not out of the respiratory season, but it's certainly, I think, we turned the corner.
Let's start.
Yeah, let's talk about these in this order. Let's talk about RSV, then we'll talk about influenza, and then we'll talk about COVID. So on the RSV front, and I'll show you the first slide from CDPH, RSV has clearly gone down. We don't expect RSV to be bimodal, so I don't think there'll be a second hump, but it's very interesting that it's kind of tailed off. It's kind of tailed off and plateaued. I put an arrow there. The dark blue dotted line is the season now, and clearly RSV is going down. And then on the front, Pfizer has a really good, and Moderna is also developing an RSV vaccine that may be out next year. So hopefully next year we'll see a vaccine for RSV that will limit not only pediatric hospitalizations, but elderly deaths with RSV. There's been already hundreds of deaths in California, so it's been a significant thing.
It'll be interesting to see if it's a pediatric vaccine along with an over 65 vaccine like our pneumococcal vaccine.
Very good question, and I don't know.
Yeah,
that's not out there yet. So I'll also show a little bit of internal data. What I showed you was California data. This is data, and I want to thank Jeff Silvers for this. This is 7-day average in Sutter, and if you look at hospitals, under 6-year-olds, 15% prevalence for RSV swabs, and in the ambulatory side, 17%. So in all other groups, it drops off precipitously. So we're still seeing a lot of RSV in kids under 6. This certainly is kindergarten and preschool age, and it seems to be predominantly an outpatient disease. So I think our colleagues in pediatrics are seeing a lot of this. So RSV is on its way down. That's really good. It's kind of tailing off. Influenza is the next slide I'll show you. This comes from CDPH. This is California data. And as you can see, again, our current season is a dark blue dotted season. And the last time we talked about this 2 weeks ago, our prevalence was 17%. We just turned the corner after 20%. Now we're down to 7%. 85%, 98% of flu is influenza A, and 85% of that is H3N2. So the H3N2 part of this influenza season's gone down. We don't know if we're going to see another one like an influenza B or an H1N1 rise in a bimodal hump. So more news there. We could have a bimodal season because of an early flu season, but you can't predict it. It kind of depends on what we do publicly. We're after the holidays. That's a good thing, So flu's gone down. Influenza hospitalizations and influenza deaths are actually slowly coming down. So our influenza prevalence has dropped precipitously, but influenza hospitalizations are down, kind of not as sharp, and influenza deaths are also down, and that always lags behind.
Yeah. And then COVID, just to complete the hat trick here, COVID swabs are coming down dramatically, going straight down. And it always interests me to see this. It just has a mind of its own. This virus doesn't really care what's going on outside because you would predict it's still wintertime, it's been raining, we're indoors like we always have been for the last month, and it's going down.
Yeah, predicting a virus is like predicting the weather.
Yeah.
Predicting a novel virus is even more difficult because it's adapting and changing with our population genetics. Yeah. So I think you're right, Gary. It's really hard to say what's going to happen there. It's hard to forecast COVID, but it is going down, and it's also more of an outpatient disease. In the past, we've talked about what about the variants of COVID, and I haven't showed this in a while, but let me show you kind of what's going on with the most common variant in the news right now, XBB 1.5. I saw this article in the New Yorker, in the New York Times. They called it the kamikaze variant. So I don't know why they picked that term. But XBB 1.5 is a sub-variant of BA2, and it's actually a combination of two variants. Now, I'm going to show you to the left. This is the Northeast US, so this is New England. And I put a red line there to show you the box that represents XBB 1.5. Now, each of these columns represents a different week. To the far left, that's October 8th week. And as you can see, BA.5 was the most prominent variant. And over time, you can see, it's really well illustrated here, which variant is kind of rising and how it increases week by week. And so to the far right is going to be the XBB 1.5 variant. Now, let me show you the right side of the screen. The right side of the screen represents region 9, where we are, California, Arizona, Nevada, and part of the Pacific Islands. And as you can see to the far right, I put a little square there. That is the XBB 1.5 variant. So it's not very prominent and prevalent in California yet. About 70% of prevalence in New England, about 8% prevalence in California. It's a little more contagious, not more severe. So the virulence hasn't really panned out for this as people were afraid of, because it was a combination of two variants come together. What we do know about XBB 1.5 is that the 1.5 is because it picked up one extra mutation that allows it to attach to the ACE2 receptor with a more affinity. So we can attach more quickly and more readily to the receptor in our body in the upper and lower respiratory tract. But that's made it more contagious, but it hasn't made it more virulent yet, at least not in larger studies. So we haven't talked about this in a while, so I thought I'd kind of show you guys that. So this, I'm going to show you one of my favorite slides. I really appreciate this slide because it shows you influenza mortality and it shows you COVID mortality at the same time. I could stare at this slide forever. I really like it. So if you look to the left and you see those small little yellow bumps, those are our annual influenza season. So that's a 2019 season, then you saw last season, 2017, it was a little bit of a higher bump, and that pales compared to the blue shaded area that represent COVID deaths. Yeah. So flu deaths versus COVID deaths. Now, let's move to the far right. I'm going to show you a couple little things I want to point out. To the far right, in the blue, look at the COVID deaths versus the yellow, the influenza deaths. COVID is still 2 to 3 times higher in mortality than COVID. So, which is really why, we always push influenza vaccination, but COVID vaccination right now is really important. And the bivalent booster is very, very important. Now, there was a little bit of a signal. There's a certain thing called the CDC's Vaccine Data Safety Link. It's kind of a network for safety. And it showed that there could be a small signal there for increased risk of stroke with a Pfizer bivalent vaccine. Now, the VAERS program, which is a Vaccine Adverse Reporting System Safety Network, didn't show a risk of COVID associated vaccine stroke in the elderly. And other studies haven't shown it, but the CDC is doing its diligence in making sure that in all populations, whether they're really young, immunosuppressed, those with comorbid problems, or really elderly, that the vaccine is safe. And so this one little signal prompted the CDC and the FDA to go back and study it more, but other studies haven't shown a risk of stroke. But your patients might be wondering about that.
So just for my benefit, the VAERS is the traditional post-release of a vaccine. They've already studied it, they've got approval, and then it's spread to a larger population. They're dependent on people reporting adverse effects. That's what the VAERS program is.
Right, that's what the VAERS program is. And then there's also this Vaccine Data Safety Link, part of the CDC, which is a combined CDC-FDA thing. And it wasn't like there was a signal of a stroke, but there was a signal that we didn't know if the stroke was safe, if there was a safety stroke. So it's kind of statistical jargon. But in case your patients, I saw it on CNN as well, but in case your patients ask about that, the recommendations for the bivalent vaccine, whether it's Pfizer or Moderna, have not changed. Yeah. Okay. And we haven't seen a confirmation of that safety link in people. So would you vaccinate someone? My mom's 91 this month. I would certainly vaccinate her. The other question I get, Carrie, is when's the next dose going to be? Yeah. We don't know. So there's no news yet about when the second bivalent booster dose is going to be, and maybe it'll be a different vaccine by this time in the fall. So we just don't know yet.
Yeah. So Gary, let's change topic a little. Something that, as we're getting used to COVID, acute COVID, I'm seeing more in the press about long COVID. And maybe you can bring us up to date in a short summary of where it's at. I know people are looking at it.
Yeah, I've actually had a couple of questions from providers, and I sent out an email to the group on that long COVID article that I wrote. It wasn't a long article, but it was an article about long COVID in something called Sonoma Health. And it was in part of the Press Democrat. I sent that out to the group as a link on Word. And a couple of caveats on long COVID is that one, and I'll show you this slide, prevalence. How often is it? In this big CDC study, it was like 7.5% prevalence. Other studies have said maybe 30%. It depends on how you study it and how you include people in that study. So it's got about, I think, about 10% prevalence, under 10%. Post-exertional fatigue, that's a hallmark. And there are 3 buckets of patients with COVID symptoms, because they're not all the same. Some people have respiratory symptoms, and they just feel more short of breath. Some people have fatigue and myalgias, and the post-exertional fatigue is really a hallmark there. And then some people have neuropsychiatric components, especially that brain fog. Those are the 3 buckets of long COVID. And some patients go a little bit back and forth on 2 or more of those. What we know, though, is that there's an increased prevalence if you're not vaccinated. So vaccine lowers the risk of long COVID, even if you get sick. So there's an increased prevalence in the unvaccinated. Younger people, more than elderly, get long COVID. And that's a little bit counterintuitive, because the elderly typically have a more severe event with long COVID. Women reported long COVID twice as much as men, and hospitalized patients had long COVID symptoms more than ambulatory patients. And that's a little bit intuitive. The kicker is, all testing you do with these patients is normal. That's typical. And that's really disconcerting to patients. Patients don't find that validating, and they don't find that comforting. You think we would, but they feel their quality of life is so impacted, and for some patients, a very small proportion, it can be pretty debilitating. And so if you're really having trouble getting back to life, quality of life, back to work, back to your normal activities, and all your tests are normal, that's a little bit frustrating. A very small percent of patients have something called POTS, which is postural orthostasis tachycardia syndrome. It's a really, really small proportion. That got a lot of press early on. And the real kicker is there's really no effective treatment. We don't know how to treat it. We don't know how to approach it. The one thing that I have counseled my colleagues on is be careful of someone who comes out of the hospital from a critical illness, because you can get depression for that. So post-hospitalization depression is something we need to watch for.
Sure.
And that could overlap with brain fog and fatigue and myalgias. But other than that, there's no effective treatment. There's a lot of things out there in the press. What about coenzyme Q? People started talking about ivermectin again. Nothing is known to work. So what I recommend is that we send patients to academic centers. And a number of them have received millions of dollars in NIH grants to study long COVID. Close to us, UCSF, Stanford, and UC Davis are all doing NIH-associated studies.
And they're doing a lot of these studies, looking at Paxlovid, looking at all kinds of things.
Yeah, different studies study different things. Some of them study symptoms, some of them study treatment, some of them study support groups. So yeah, each study is a little bit different. And so patients may want to look on different websites. Now, in the article I sent everyone, I actually added, this is not in the article, but it's in what I sent to everyone on our attachment, is at the very end of there, at a UCSS website, kind of some really helpful information and links for patients with support groups and where to go for other studies as well.
So I'd imagine referring them to you is not going to be helpful, because you don't have anything to offer, and you're not a center that's doing research on this, so you would just tell them to go on to a tertiary center. So that's what we should be doing if we...
That's correct. Yeah, I haven't been seeing patients with long COVID,
Okay.
and I've been recommending to providers that they send it to an academic center.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Good,
so
good.
that's a little bit of information on there.
So Gary, we've been through a lot, we're through this process far enough that we're talking less and less about acute COVID, we're starting to talk about long COVID, and kind of this is an endemic virus, and things are starting to reach a new normal. You've created some slides that are very interesting, I think, about the retrospective view.
So I hope this is helpful, but I think it's really important that you don't forget where you came from. And when this first broke, the way infectious disease doctors looked at a pandemic was we knew it was going to be a disaster. This is like an earthquake, this is like a flood, this is like a major fire. It's going to be a disastrous moment, and how you handle it is going to mitigate the effect of that. And so going back to 2019, I could really say that things have changed a lot, and it's good just to remember that. In 2019, we had this novel virus, and anything that's new and novel is going to be pretty anxiety provoking. We didn't know what to expect. We kind of thought about, what about the 1918 influenza pandemic? And then we also remember in 2003, the first SARS virus that came out, that coronavirus, how virulent it was. And it kind of mirrored, in 2003, the SARS-CoV virus kind of mirrored 1918 pandemic, where people got really sick really quick and didn't survive the first couple of days. This one was really different. And so we had this novel virus. As it mutated, it became more contagious and it became more dangerous. And that was right up to the Delta virus. After the Delta strain, it became less virulent, thank goodness. But for the first couple evolutions, It was more virulent and more contagious. We didn't know if PPE would stand up. Now, we knew it worked great with measles. And looking back, look, if it works for measles and TB, it'll be fine for this. But we didn't know that. And SARS, in 2003, SARS had some outbreaks, and we weren't sure, like in Canada and in Hong Kong, and we were wondering if the PPE would hold up to this. And that was somewhat anxiety-provoking. We struggled with testing. I don't know if people remember this. Remember, it took a week for the CDC to agree to a test?
We didn't have any testing to start with. Yeah.
And then test, so testing was a nightmare. And then how to treat. We know we could support people, you could put someone on a ventilator, but could you do anything meaningfully to save a life? And we didn't know if any of our treatments were going to work. We didn't know anything about the pathophysiology because it seemed to act very different. In SARS 2003, that was a rapid viral illness that resulted in death and multi-organ failure. This was this common cold, kind of felt like a bad cold, then it kind of felt like the flu, and a week later you started to get short of breath. Had a very different time course. And so what I found myself doing is reading the scientific papers late at night and trying to keep up with, and then sharing them in the morning with my colleagues in the hospital and people like Jeff Silvers in the region, asking what's the best thing to do. Attending this weekly CDC thing on Saturdays, and I still do that, just to say, hey, what's the latest, what's the greatest, and what's the science? And I really like that element that early on, we had to remind ourselves to trust the science. Trust the science, trust the science, trust the science, and don't go off the reservation.
Yeah.
You know, we were really hoping for an effective vaccine, and masks and toilet papers were in very short supply, and I wish I had put my money down on plexiglass, because that industry took off.
They still survive.
So that was 2019. What about today? Today we don't have a novel virus, we have an endemic virus. It's very different now. And the Omicron subvariants, they might be more contagious, but they're less severe. And that's really reassuring. Now we know that PPE works, and it works really well. And we know that masks keep us safe, and masks keeps other people safe from spreading virus amongst themselves. I think it's really important to remember that we're more likely to get sick outside of work. So being in Safeway, Costco, church, family gatherings, those are normally going to be a risk for respiratory viruses, but what we're doing at work really helps. So it's safe to be at work, even though this is where sick patients come. Testing is now easy. We take that for granted now. Do it at home. Keep doing it because everyone has tests at home. And now we have specific treatment options. We have options and we understand modalities more. And Gary, I have to tell you, I never thought I would be in the ICU determining anticoagulation, dexamethasone, and tocilizumab. I didn't even know what tocilizumab was before the pandemic hit, you know? And we did have remdesivir. And remember that our hospital was really reported in the New England Journal of Medicine as one of the first hospitals worldwide to present remdesivir safety and efficacy. So I think we're at the forefront of the vaccine of the pandemic. The mRNA vaccines, the ones made in the United States, were the best in the world. You have to remember that we had the best vaccines in the world. Because of that, we had the best chance of survival in the world and the lower number of deaths. In fact, as of December 13th in the publication, we think in the US, 1.1 million people have died. We saved 3.2 million lives. So imagine 4.5 million people. With the vaccine, we've saved 3.2 million lives and more than 18 million hospitalizations, which would have really put us beyond surge capacity. The one caveat I'd like to put here, I should have highlighted it more, is that I think that life and work is much safer now. So where we are in the world is a much safer place than just a couple of years ago. And our patients can now come back to clinic, and they can come back to clinic even with COVID symptoms. They can come back to clinic safely because our protocols work. And I think that's really important because I think our patients are really anxious and they really need us. We feel exhausted, but our patients feel exhausted. We have the luxury of, in the medical field, having a better understanding of what happened from a health perspective, but many of our patients don't. And I think it's really good our patients are kind of reaching back to us, and we're able to reach out and in the clinic touch them again, which is really great. So I think where we are today is very different from before. And now it's kind of more what's political versus what's safe.
I mean, a tangible sign of that is that we don't have a respiratory clinic anymore.
Yeah,
And,
that's right.
people, acutely ill people were funneled into one clinic, and now people get acutely ill for a variety of reasons, and we're capable of handling a back and acute situation in our office like we always have been doing.
Right.
what you've laid out here, what's very symbolic in our next slide, is the new signage and the new process screening requirements we have at the clinics. So this is now really an endemic issue. And this slide shows you what the new signs that are going on in our clinics that are going up on the windows. It's saying continue to wear a mask, and I'm not sure that ever is going to go away. But then they list some of the symptoms that they want people to report. Previously, people would stop outside and have to call the receptionist inside. Mm-hmm. Now they're saying, come on inside. If you are experiencing these symptoms, let the receptionist know. Interestingly, previously, whenever people made an appointment, they were screened. When they made an appointment online, they were screened. All that's been dropped. Now we're just telling our patients, come back in. If you have these symptoms, let somebody know at the front desk. Now, interestingly, these aren't necessarily just COVID symptoms, are they?
That's right, and I want to give a shout out to Elaine. Elaine McCann was great. She kind of came up with this idea, and then we kind of ran with it, made this sign together, and then we had to really push this with our leadership, because our leadership wanted to say, there's no COVID on this, there's no Ebola on this, there's no measles on this. And we thought we would take three things that would sort of probably encompass 90% of the things that we would see. So why is there diarrhea on this? Because we want our staff to be careful that they don't pick up C. difficile.
Right.
You know, why is there a new cough on this? Because besides COVID, there is the flu, there is RSV, and you can get parainfluenza virus and pertussis. Right. So just tell the respiratory therapist if you have a new cough in the last 7 days, so that the staff can make sure maybe they don't need to wear just a mask, maybe goggles as well. You know, and then why a rash? Measles. So we want to make sure if someone comes in with measles.
Fever plus rash.
Yeah, fever plus rash, because it's not contact dermatitis. Yeah. You know, it's fever and a rash thinking of measles, because we have this cohort of unvaccinated population. So I really want to shout out to Elaine. I mean, she was really good, and it took us a tremendous amount of work politically to kind of sensibly put something out there that's more symptom-based and syndromic-based.
Well, this is a new evolution. So this is not screening for COVID. This is a different perspective. This is screening for infectious disease.
Right.
Contagious infectious disease.
Right.
Yeah.
And what Elaine and I think about with the cough is TB. It doesn't happen very often, but every year there's one case of TB that rattles around the clinics. Yeah. And this keeps that even safer. So
great.
Normal stuff.
Well, that brings us to a close of our clinical information. I do have one announcement that I had made previously at our all group meeting a couple of weeks ago, and that is we now have our list of required training courses. This is for our clinicians at Smugger here. This list is posted here, and you'll see a couple things. They've added one small course, this hazardous waste handling course, which I think we're going to try to accomplish at an all-group meeting this spring and get that checked off your list. But the first two courses at the top are ones you're well familiar with. They are available to start now, and then the last one, of course, is the state-mandated harassment course, which we do every 2 years, which is longer in length and won't be available until April 1st. Remember, HealthStream has gone away. All these courses are available on Workday, and I sent the instructions on how to access the courses. It's actually very straightforward once you've done it once. And that email went out to you as a PowerPoint slide deck on January 11th. So if you don't know how to get on Workday, go back and look for the email from me on January 11th. And let's start chipping away at this. We know these are all required, and we've got a deadline, so we'll do it yet again. So thanks for your time. Hope this was helpful.
Thank you very much.